In a quiet park on a sunny afternoon in Atlanta, a 14-year-old black boy sat on a bench reading a book, waiting for his mom. But his peaceful moment was shattered when a suspicious woman confronted him, accusing him of loitering and calling the police. Tension rose as officers arrived, questioning the boy like a criminal. Just when the situation seemed ready to spiral out of control, a sleek black SUV pulled up, and out stepped the city's mayor, his mother. What happened next left the entire park speechless and sparked a conversation the community would never forget. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays over Riverside Park in Atlanta, Georgia, filtering through the swaying branches of old oak trees. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, where parents sat on benches chatting and watching their kids. Joggers passed by in steady rhythms, earbuds in, lost in their workouts. Birds chirped overhead, adding to the idyllic atmosphere. It was the kind of place where peace felt almost sacred, until it wasn't. On a weathered wooden bench near the fountain, Jamal Carter sat with a book resting on his lap. 14 years old, tall for his age, and lean from playing basketball. He was the picture of quiet focus. He wore a plain white t-shirt and slightly faded jeans. His shoes scuffed but clean. His dark, thoughtful eyes scanned the words on the page. But every so often he glanced at his phone to check the time. His mom, Naomi Carter, had promised to pick him up after finishing a late meeting at City Hall. Jamal didn't mind the wait. He liked the park, the open space, the sounds of life swirling around him, and the feel of the sun warming his skin. It was one of the few places where he felt truly at ease. But today, something felt different. A tingling sense of unease crept into his chest. He shifted slightly, lifting his eyes from the book. Across the park, a woman sat on a nearby bench. She wasn't watching the children or enjoying the scenery. She was watching him. Margaret Davis, in her mid-40s with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, sat rigidly, clutching her handbag. She wore neatly pressed khakis and a button-up shirt, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. Her gaze was fixed on Jamal, narrowing slightly each time he shifted or looked up from his book. At first, Jamal tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was overthinking things. But as the minutes ticked by, her stares became harder to ignore. She whispered into her phone at one point, glancing at him between sentences. Jamal's hands tightened around the edges of his book. He had dealt with looks like this before, people clutching their purses tighter when he walked by, crossing the street to avoid him, or staring just a little too long as if expecting him to do something wrong. He hated it, but he'd learned to let it roll off his back. Today, though, was different. Today, he was alone. Margaret finally stood, walking toward him with purposeful strides. Jamal sat up straighter, bracing himself. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and cutting through the hum of the park like a knife. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. I'm just waiting for my mom," he said, keeping his tone polite and steady even as his heart began to race. Margaret crossed her arms, her eyes scanning him as though searching for cracks in his story. "I've seen you sitting here for a while now. People like you don't just hang out at parks for no reason." Jamal's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you. "I promise. I'm not doing anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice firm but calm. "My mom is on her way to pick me up. She's running a little late." Margaret didn't budge. "Do you have ID? Proof that you're supposed to be here?" Jamal shook his head. "No, ma'am. I don't carry ID. I'm only 14. The words had barely left his mouth before Margaret pulled out her phone and began dialing. "I'm calling the police," she announced. Panic flared in Jamal's chest. "Wait. What? Why? I didn't do anything." Margaret turned away from him, speaking loudly into her phone. "Yes, there's a suspicious individual in Riverside Park. Young black male, about 14 or 15. He's been hanging around and acting strange. I think he might be up to something." Jamal froze, his thoughts racing. Should he run? Should he stay? He knew that running would only make things worse. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted to the bench even as tears burned behind his eyes. People nearby started to notice. A few whispered, Others pulled out their phones, but no one stepped in. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Two police cruisers roared to a stop near the entrance of the park, red and blue lights flashing. Jamal's breath hitched as the officers stepped out. The first officer, Sam Carter, was young, tall, and broad-shouldered. His uniform looked crisp, and his eyes immediately locked onto Jamal. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Carter ordered. Jamal stood slowly, raising his hands. "I didn't do anything, sir." "We'll figure that out," Carter replied. "Just stay where you are and don't move." The second officer, Sergeant Bennett, older and calmer, approached more cautiously. Scanning the scene, Margaret stepped forward, pointing at Jamal. "That's him," she said. "He's been sitting here, watching people for almost an hour. I think he's casing the place." Jamal's voice shook as he tried to explain. "I'm waiting for my mom. She's picking me up soon. I haven't done anything wrong." Sergeant Bennett studied Jamal, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You said your mom is coming to pick you up?" "Yes, sir. She should be here any minute," Jamal replied, his hands still raised. The tension in the park was palpable, the sharp bark of commands and the flashing red and blue lights making Jamal's heart pound. Around him, the gathering crowd murmured in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between Jamal and the officers. Some whispered anxiously, while others raised their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Margaret stood a few feet away, arms crossed and lips pressed into a tight line, her phone still clutched in her hand. Then, the sound of a car pulling up nearby interrupted the standoff. Heads turned as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the edge of the park. The rear door opened, and out stepped Naomi Carter, sharp, poised, and radiating authority in her tailored suit. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as recognition rippled through the onlookers. "Isn't that the mayor?" someone whispered. Margaret's face drained of color. Naomi's heels clicked against the pavement as she strode toward the scene, her gaze locked onto her son. Her expression was a mixture of relief and simmering anger. "Jamal," she called, her voice firm. "Mom." Jamal choked out, his hands still raised. Naomi's eyes shifted immediately to the officers, then to Margaret, who suddenly looked very small despite her earlier bravado. "What is going on here?" Naomi demanded, her voice low but carrying undeniable weight. Sergeant Bennett straightened, taking a respectful step back. Officer Carter looked visibly nervous, his earlier confidence evaporating. Naomi's gaze swept over the scene, taking in her son's raised hands, the flashing lights, and the tense crowd. She placed a protective hand on Jamal's shoulder, her voice steady but seething with controlled anger as she addressed the officers. "You mean to tell me that my son, sitting here quietly, reading a book, warranted this kind of response?" Margaret stammered, her earlier self-assurance crumbling. "I didn't mean. I thought." Naomi's sharp gaze silenced her. "You thought wrong," she said curtly. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Sergeant Bennett finally spoke. "Mayor Carter, I apologize for how this unfolded. We'll file a full report and—" "A report?" Naomi's voice cut through him. "This isn't just about a report. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again, to my son or anyone else." She turned to the crowd. "Thank you all for being here. Thank you for bearing witness. We'll need your voices to make sure this incident sparks real change." Margaret, pale and shaking, whispered, I'm sorry." Jamal finally lowered his hands, his mother's presence anchoring him. Naomi turned to him, her expression softening. "Let's go home, baby," she said. As they walked away, Jamal held his head high, but he couldn't help but wonder how different the outcome might have been if his mother hadn't arrived when she did. This wasn't the end of the story for Jamal, his mother, or their community. It was just the beginning of a conversation they couldn't afford to ignore.